and welcome to this week's edition of Rating the News. I'm Vanessa Otero, the founder and CEO of Adfontes Media. We create the famous media bias chart. And this week we're talking about RT America and why it's always important to identify reliability and bias issues, especially for unusual news sources like RT, and especially when the stakes are high, such as in the case of a pending or actual war. Now, in this episode, we'll talk about our rating of RT based on individual articles and TV shows, and why we've rated them quite low for reliability, even before the current conflict. But for context, let's back up. This week, we've just experienced and are continuing to experience some really jarring news cycles about complex international events. In the last few weeks, there has been this coverage about the potential for war, and now coverage about an actual war. And there's been a lot of conflicting information in that news, with some people believing that Russia was going to attack and others not. These news cycles highlight two things. First, it highlights how important it is to be informed about big international stories. Now, why is that important? A lot of folks can try to ignore big international news stories because they're complex and people sometimes find them boring, but you should want to know generally what's happening in the world around you, and particularly what our leaders, like our president and our senators, are doing about it, and whether you support them. You want to know whether you support what they're doing. In order to that, you need to know what's actually going on. You have the power to vote them in and out. You have the power to put public pressure on them. And that's important because their decisions can affect whether we end up involved in a war or not. Those things can affect our lives, like whether members of our families and communities may get sent off to war. And we do get involved in a military conflict. War could affect our very own economies and livelihoods. They could be really deeply impacted. But the second thing these news cycles highlight is how important it is to get your news from highly reliable, minimally biased sources, like 40 and above on our chart. I'm just going to bring up our interactive media bias chart just for your quick reference here. Here's our media bias chart, blank version. So, on a scale from 0 to 64, above this line of 40 are the most highly reliable sources that you want to stick with. Everyone's heard about the Russian invasion of Ukraine at this point, but some of us get our news from superficial, highly partisan coverage, and this really isn't the time for that. In times like this, it's important to know the truth. And the truth is, when it comes to international conflicts, can be hard even for good journalists to cover. What do we mean by that? Let's cover concepts of how we know what we know when there's a war going on halfway around the world. In circumstances on reporting on war and military operations and government statements, there are a lot of ways that information can get into the journalist's report, right? So when we are looking to news reporting, what we ultimately want to know is what happened or what is happening on the ground. Okay. And, since it's far away in a place that we're not, we have to rely on journalists to go get that information for us, journalists or others around the world to get that information from us. So what's the best way to get that information? Well, this information about what's happening and what happened and the journalist report, that information has to come from somewhere. So the best way for it to get there is from firsthand reporting. So there are many brave journalists from news organizations all around the world that are actually on the ground in Ukraine and surrounding areas, bringing firsthand reports, like eyewitness reports, interviews with local residents, and being on the ground, seeing primary sources. That's ideal. But there's other ways to get information because there's a lot of information. It's rapidly changing, right? So there's also statements from the government and military officials. Now, especially in the lead up to the conflict, like before there was actually a conflict, reporters relied heavily on, statements from governments like the US government, Russian government, other Western allies governments to see what was happening. Our US government was saying, it looks like there's lots of troops building up around the Ukrainian border, and we think there might be a war. We think Russia might attack. Now, this information from government and military officials, there are a lot of reasons why different governments will say different things. Different military officers will say different things. For example, the U.S. government was saying Russia's probably going to attack. Russia's government is like, no, we're not going to attack. So they have obviously conflicting points of view and conflicting reasons for saying what they're saying. So you have to take those statements with a grain of salt. Also, compounding the trust issues and ability to verify statements from military and government officials, a lot of this information comes from government intelligence, and government intelligence can be faulty or incomplete. That's possible, right? So often when in good reporting, the journalists are going to try to corroborate reporting from government and military officials. So, for example, during this conflict right now, reports will say, the Ukrainian government said that they shot down a Russian plane, but we could not independently verify that. So they'll say both things. They'll say, this is what the government said, and we haven't been able to corroborate that. And if they were able to do both those things, then you could have high confidence that that was true. There's also available outside evidence that you could rely on besides just firsthand reporting or statements from government officials, right? So if the United States government says, looks like there's about 190,000 Russian troops stationed around the Ukrainian border, yes, that's certainly things that the government is saying, that government intelligence is saying, but there's available outside evidence. Like there are satellite images from private U.S. companies, showing actual, troop buildup. So you want to rely. Journalists want to use all of these things to come up with the best picture of the truth. That's hard to do, right? Being on the ground is hard. Corroborating information from government officials is hard. Rounding up other intelligence or outside evidence is hard. And this is for the reliable journalists, right? This is for the folks who are like up in this area, trying their best to bring you the facts. You get into even more trouble if you're relying on folks that are just, talking about what they think is happening in terms of analysis or opinion, and they're not actually doing the journalism themselves. Like, why would you rely on that, on stuff that's, opinion for your news in this kind of context? You shouldn't. Okay. All right. Let's actually talk about RT. We talk a lot about reliability and bias, and this is a United States media bias chart. Left-right U.S. political bias is a primary bias factor that we measure from left to right, but there are other sorts of bias. RT America has headquarters in the United States, hires American journalists. They have a web property and a TV network. That TV network has at least 21 different news shows that you can watch on DirecTV and Dish and Roku and other like cable and streaming channels. But it's owned by and funded by the Russian government. It's interesting to have a journalism organization in the United States that's funded and owned by one of our geopolitical foes. Now, Russia and China are the most nuanced way that folks refer to them and have referred to them over the last few years is that they're geopolitical foes or geopolitical rivals, not necessarily enemies. Now, in the last few days, given Russia's aggression against Ukraine, the United States and the West generally definitely have a posture towards Russia that's more like enemies. But in the past, there's been conflict between Russia and the United States, but we still have trade relations. The leaders of the countries meet regularly at summits, right? So it's not like they're just we've been enemies at war for the most recent past. It's not the case. They're geopolitical foes because Russia doesn't like some things we do, and we don't like some things that Russia does, right? So Russia has a leader that, and they have elections, and it's quasi-democratic, but really it's somewhat authoritarian because Putin's been in power for many, many years, and the elections just seem to always elect him. And the United States has been critical of the Russian government, like poisoning and jailing its enemies. The Russian government has coordinated like inauthentic user internet campaigns during our elections to influence U.S. political sentiment and drive wedges between folks, like famous campaigns on Facebook and Twitter with bots trying to stir up like political divides in the country. So Russia is definitely trying to poke the U.S. in the eye over the years. They're a foe, right? A geopolitical foe. But the United States allows freedom of press. So if you have a press organization in the United States hiring American journalists, the government really doesn't have a position to say, like, you can't broadcast RT here, right? That would be sort of difficult. So RT does broadcast here. And they don't necessarily have a strict left to right uniform bias, like a lot of the less reliable news sources that we see here in the United States. Let's take a look at where RT's bias lies. Russia Today, and this is their online content. So this is really unusual compared to other news sources, because you see a really big spread. We have some stuff that's pretty far left over here, and then stuff that's pretty far right. We'll just take a look at some headlines. Here's an article on RT that's rated as analysis of opinion over to the left. And it's dear anti-vaxxers, ask yourselves this: why would Bill Gates and big government want to monitor your incredibly dull lives? So it's poking the eye at anti-vaxxers, which are typically aligned in the right in the United States. Let's take a look at some stuff here over here on the right. We've got this headline. During the impeachment, the Republicans backing the president's impeachment are condemning their party to years in the wilderness. Their treacherous acts in siding with Democrats will come back to haunt them because Republican-leaning voters like me feel cheated. But isn't it just so typical of our politicians who are all just out for themselves? So this is like pretty right-leaning content, right? So, but not all of the content is squarely left or squarely right. You'll see articles down here that are just sort of squarely anti-American. This article was about, it was debunked. This article basically accused the United States of like abandoning their canine army dogs at the Kabul airport. If you look at some of the TV content, it's even fuzzier left to right. If you look at the TV content, here are RT's TV shows. See, here's the overall TV network score. It's sort of in the middle. It's in this opinion or high variation in reliability. And it's really because it's high variation in reliability. Like there's stuff up here for reliability, but then there's stuff out here for reliability. So let's take a look at these shows that are over to the left or over to the right. Even this show that's over to the left has some very left-leaning shows and some very right-leaning shows in terms of U.S. left to right bias. Now, what do these kinds of bias have in common from left to right? It's not so much that RT is always left or always right. As you can see, it's not. But oftentimes it's anti-American and like anti-American bias, and particularly right now, pro-Putin's government bias. So we can capture bias that's not strictly left or right in our chart. Like we capture anti-American bias or even anti-Russian bias. If this doesn't exist in RT really, but if you were to take an opinion article in the United States that was anti-Russian bias, we would identify like anti-Russian bias in the United States isn't strictly left or right. There are folks on the left and on the right. They're like, yeah, Russia's no good. So anti-Russian bias in opinion would show up because it's lower on it's, even though it's middle, left, right, it's lower on the opinion scale. So you have the nature of anti-American bias in RT shows up sometimes on the left as like anti-capitalist, anti-police bias, which in the United States finds a home on the far left, right? Anti-American government, anti-American U.S. intelligence certainly finds a home on the left. Let's take a look at this one. So this is one of the lowest rated left-leaning shows called Redacted Tonight, which purports to be a comedy show, but it's just really ranty, and there aren't really any jokes. And it's about how to end homelessness and how the energy industry is price gouging. So, these are issues that resonate and find a home. They're anti things that are happening in America, but they find a home on the left in the United States. Then you'll have shows like Crosstalk over here, and it's for this right show that we rated. Let's just take a look at the title and the headline. Home edition, January 6th hoax. So just reading the caption, there are calls for a 9/11 style investigation into the Capitol Hill riots of January 6th. Is this an effort to seek the truth or to fabricate another massive political hoax? So that's really glomming on to stuff that's taken hold on the right in the United States, calling to January 6th a hoax. Oh, and then look at this. Also, does NATO want Russia and Ukraine to go to war? This is interesting because this is from April 2021. So, there's lots of reasons to be skeptical about RT just based on their content over time. But it can be a little bit confusing because look at this widespread, RT has hired lots of American employees, including famous journalists and commentators. Dennis Miller has a show on RT. Larry King used to have a show. Ed Schultz, who used to be with MSNBC, had a show on RT. They've hired journalists with good reputations. So there's really a widespread in reliability and a widespread in bias. So what we've done in terms of rating RT's web content, it's a really unusual news source, but it's got some stuff that is high reliability. There's no reliability issues with it really, and then some stuff that leans right. Lots of content on the web that leans right and is highly opinionated or selective or incomplete. A little bit of that on the left, but then when you go over to the TV content, it's quite a lot of left-leaning analysis and opinion. But when you see the bias, it's often an anti-American bias. So you just want to be aware of that. Now, there are reasons why this RT itself is widely appealing to many Americans, right? If you agree that capitalism sucks and this show is telling you all about that, that confirms your bias. If you agree that the January 6th, the whole thing and the investigation into it is a hoax, that confirms your bias on the right. If you think of yourself as just an independent thinker who doesn't just want to follow American news, wants to see things from the other side, like the Russian side, then you'd it's really appealing to see articles from international coverage, including Russia, that don't have any reliabilities. But because of the really widespread, because it's a geopolitical foe, and because over the sample of content that we've rated, there's enough instances of highly biased, low reliability content. You should be skeptical of things you watch from RT. What's the harm in entertaining information from a source that's got a questionable reliability background like RT in the first place? Okay. The world is complicated. Issues like international conflicts are complicated. And in order to sort ourselves into what we think about the world and what side we're on in any particular situation, we use shortcuts and we use heuristics. And often those fall into like left, right, us versus them, like binaries. Like you have folks on my side to think one way, I'm going to just go with that. Right. And when it comes to like really far left or really far right biases, these can really throw you off. And let me show you what I mean. So Tucker Carlson, really far right, lots of stuff in this problematic area. And you may have seen this clip, and I'm just going to go ahead and play it.
It'd be worth asking yourself, since it is getting pretty serious, what is this really about?
Why do I hate Putin so much? Has Putin ever called me a racist? Has he threatened to get me fired for disagreeing with him? Has he shipped every middle-class job in my town to Russia? Did he manufacture a worldwide pandemic that wrecked my business and kept me indoors for 2 years? Is he teaching my children to embrace racial discrimination? Is he making fentanyl? Is he trying to snuff out Christianity? Does he eat dogs? These are fair questions, and the answer to all of them is no. Vladimir Putin didn't do any of that.
So that's really interesting. Tucker Carlson's not doing any reporting here, right? He's just trying to provide some take on just Russia and Putin in general. And instead of doing actual reporting, he's relying on, and his audience is relying on heuristics of, why should we, whose side should we be on in like Russia versus, the West in this situation? And an easy like proxy or heuristic is like, well, our president is Biden. Biden is a Democrat. I don't like Democrats. So, maybe the things that the Democrats are for, I want to be against. And the thing that Tucker Carlson's show focuses on so much, from show to show to show, is that the left is bad. Like the left is terrible. So instead of, making a case about, being pro or against Putin's point of view, he uses as a proxy, well, the left thinks that Putin is bad, but look at the difference between us and the left, and he bases his argument on things that like the left does, like calling you racist and that whole diatribe, right? So because the heuristic he's using is, my enemies, the left and Democrats, Joe Biden, like all this stuff on the left don't like Putin. Well, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so I'm going to kind of be for Putin in this episode. That's not a great way to go and make decisions about who's right and wrong in an international conflict. Okay. But let's look at a different example on the left. And let's show the difference between something that's really, really far right and what our elected representatives on the right actually think, right? So this article in Politico says GOP to Tucker Carlson, we're the decision makers on Ukraine, not you. Our left-right axis is based on positions of U.S. elected officials. And so the positions of U.S. elected officials in this Russia-Ukraine crisis is really different from what Tucker Carlson is saying. So Tucker Carlson is like, well, Putin's not your enemy. And and here, like Republican senators and the president and like people who actually like know what's going on, like Republican senators are unmoved by Tucker Carlson's relentless warpath against support from Ukraine. The Fox News primetime host and others on the far right have excused and even rationalized Russia's aggression toward Ukraine and downplayed its irrelevance to U.S. national security. But these senators, like Senator Mike Brown's, says, on individuals up here who are decision makers, I don't hear any disagreement about what the position in Russia is, said Mike Rounds, a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Russia is the aggressor. Ukraine has every right as a sovereign nation to have their borders respected. And so there's more, there's more quotes from senators. So like in recent days, Carlson has attacked Republicans who are pushing for a stronger response to Moscow's aggression. This was before Russia actually invaded, slamming Senator Joni Ernst and Senator Jim Risch, who are also Republicans, as morons and neocon buffoons. And then, Senator Marco Rubio, the top Republican on the Senate Intelligence Committee. He said, I don't agree with those views. So Rep. Tom Malinowski, who's a Democrat for New Jersey, he's a former top State Department official who just returned from a bipartisan delegation in Kyiv. So here you have, quotes from senators and representatives, Democratic and Republican ones in Congress that are largely on the same page about Russia's role in aggression versus Ukraine. And Tom Malinowski revealed last week that his office was receiving calls from people who say they watch Tucker Carlson and are upset that we're not siding with Russia in its threats to invade Ukraine and want me to support Russia's reasonable positions. You don't want to be those guys. So you don't want to get your news from Tucker Carlson on something like this. You don't want to, and it's not just him, you don't want to get your news from somebody whose takes are based on these heuristics of, my side thinks this and the other side thinks this, and sources that have a reputation for pretty extreme bias on their side. So I said I would show you an example of how this happens on the left. So this is a news source that's pretty far over to the left. So there's, way over here in hyperpartisan left, it has some fine reporting, but then it also has some really way out there reporting on the left. And if you look at the some of the popular stories, common themes are about skepticism of U.S. intelligence and in general opposition to the U.S. foreign policy as being warmongering and in it for profit. Those are themes of this reporting. So two of the journalists that spoke with the deputy permanent representative of Russia to the UN on escalated tensions at the Russian-Ukraine border, U.S. accusations of an imminent Russian invasion, and the context missing from a U.S. media that refuses to interview Russian officials. I'm going to just play a little bit of this.
Welcome, everybody, to the Gray Zone. Thanks for tuning in. So to help us make sense of what's going on, we're very fortunate to be joined today by Dmitry Polyansky. He is the Deputy Russian Ambassador to the United Nations. Ambassador, hello.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Max. I just have trouble in understanding what does it mean in English. My English is not good enough to advance its capabilities.
To advance its ability to invade, yeah.
My God.
Well, we're all left puzzling as to what they're trying.
Such creative people we have. Yeah. This is all ridiculous, of course, and we learn each and every day something about ourselves, about our alleged plans to attack, to invade, and this comes to a total surprise to us, and this comes to a total surprise of Ukrainians as well, which is especially strange. So it looks like only the Americans are sure of something, but they don't share this information neither with us nor with the Ukrainians. So I don't know who can de-escalate this situation. I think only those who have escalated it, and in fact, it's not us.
So this is really interesting. This is just days before the actual invasion. I mean, looking back, it looks ridiculous that the premise of the host was that the U.S. is just beating these war drums, and the U.S. intelligence community, the bias against the U.S. intelligence from this source is really strong. And so the proxy that they're using for whether to determine what's likely to happen, is Russia likely to invade, is really highly based on the heuristic of, we don't trust Western intelligence, we don't trust the US intelligence because in the past they've lied, in the past they've gotten us into wars, and we just fundamentally disagree and are very skeptical of US intelligence. But so much so that they take the word of an interview, this ambassador from Russia, who goes on there and says, "Oh yes, of course, this U.S. intelligence is ridiculous," right? these reporters, once Russia invaded, they apologized and said that they were wrong. They didn't think that Russia was going to invade, and clearly, like they made statements on Twitter saying they were wrong. One of the reasons you can get things so wrong is that if you have such inherent bias to begin with, that it just blinds you to other things that are actually happening on the ground. So if this, like the actual reporting that would have helped, is the stuff that we covered in the beginning. Like, look at the actual things that are happening on the ground. Try to corroborate statements from foreign officials. Look at evidence, other available evidence. So, what's other available evidence? Sure, you can distrust the intelligence community in the United States and be skeptical of U.S. intentions for escalating a situation. That's reasonable. But you also have other evidence of countries around the world, like coming together and corroborating what the U.S. is saying, like other NATO allies. You can look at reporting from BBC and Al Jazeera. That's a lot of evidence, and it's not just the U.S. It's not just one source of intelligence that led to these conclusions. Instead of relying on sources with lots of bias and lots of opinion content, whether it's on the far right or the far left, or sources that are biased, like anti-American bias, that sort of shake out in the middle, it's important to be skeptical of those. And it's preferable to just not never rely on those ever, because there are so many other good news sources out there that you can get great information from. Before, you should have been skeptical of RT, given the high variation in reliability. But now, especially now, like during the middle of the conflict, be even more skeptical, right? So here's a top story on RT today. Ukraine's leadership has rejected negotiations, Kremlin. That's a really interesting way to put that there. Well, we'd stop being at war with them, but they just rejected the negotiations. You want to take that with a grain of salt. Now, again, I understand the desire for folks to want to get other perspectives outside of just U.S. media. But where can you go to for those? You can go to BBC, Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is owned by Qatar, has a lot of former BBC journalists, has a lot of, even though it's owned by Qatar, has a lot of freedom over their reporting, has a great international reporting reputation. There are lots of organizations that have many reporters on the ground all over the world, like our own US-based wire services, such as AP and Reuters. There are other wire services like UPI and AFP. And what those news sources have in common is that they have a lot of reporters they send to international locations. And those are places where you can get as objective as possible truth. Now, objective reporting is not about trying to remain neutral, right? That's not the point of it. It's actually the opposite in times of crisis. Objective reporting helps you clearly see what's right and wrong. You don't need opinion pieces to tell you what to think. When you know the facts, you can use your own reasoning, experience, and moral judgment to decide what side you're on. And I'll end with this reporting from the Wall Street Journal. This article has a number of pictures of folks lining up. The title is Ukraine Forces Repel Russian Attack on Kyiv, Prepare for Next Assault. Thousands of civilians take up arms to defend the capital, while Russian forces face fierce resistance throughout Ukraine. And so throughout this is fact-based reporting, and no analysis or opinion, not much to speak of anyways. Lots of quotes from people on the ground, and sometimes that's all you need. Let's take a look at quotes here and facts here. A Russian rocket hit a building near my home this morning. This was the last straw for me. And now it's time to take up arms. Everyone in the city who wanted to escape has already fled, said one of the new recruits, a 35-year-old IT specialist. There is nowhere to run and no point in hiding. We just have to repel the invaders and send them back where they came from, said another, a human resources specialist. In this case, the facts just hit you in the heart. Thanks for joining us this week, and we'll see you next time.